So welcome one and all to tonight's session. This is our annual update on keeping children and young people safe in your triathlon club. We've run a session, I think, every year for the past 5 years, and it's part of our small but committed role that we play in trying to educate you all on how to keep your club safe. There's a whole bunch of resources which we'll talk to. There's a few on our website, which as we go through the presentation and we talk tonight, I will share in the chat. I guess the message from me is thank you very much for giving up your Tuesday night. This is a very important topic, and it's something that we all take seriously, something that the New South Wales Triathlon Board have taken quite seriously over many, many years. I would also say that it's one of those topics where New South Wales legislation means that it's kind of one of those odd dynamics between the National Integrity Framework and New South Wales legislation. And sometimes there's some conversations around that. But leading tonight's session is Matt Sibley, who should be no stranger because he has previously worked for the Office of Children's Guardian, and he has been involved in running this session for us over the last number of years, and all of the documents that are up online he's reviewed. He is an expert on this subject matter. We're really glad that he would join us tonight. He's no longer with the Office of Children's Guardian. He now works for a company called Safe Sports Solutions. But we are really, really lucky to have him joining us. And we'll kind of jump in and he'll guide tonight's discussion. And perhaps if there's areas specific, please, I'll jump in as well. If everyone could just keep themselves muted just to avoid any background noise. Maybe if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to type it out or throw your hand up and I'll monitor that. And maybe when the moment is appropriate, throw to the questions, but you're very welcome to chuck a question up in the chat. My final comment before I hand over is, whilst we're all here tonight, I don't want anyone to feel like this is your one opportunity to ask questions or work in this space or get our support and assistance with you to work in this space. We're always available to help you out, whether it's going through a risk assessment or talking to you about the 10 child safe standards or going through working with children check requirements, whatever it is, whatever topic it is that you guys are discussing at 365 days a year. Well, maybe not Christmas Day, but maybe all the other days of the year, you're very welcome to reach out to us. So with that long little intro, we'll throw over to Matt.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about child safeguarding and triathlon and also touch on child safe risk a bit as well. And as Adam was saying, a lot of the things we're going to talk about tonight, there's been a lot of groundwork that's gone on behind the scenes between Adam and me, for instance, for a number of years now. So more than anything at the end of tonight, you should be walking away feeling like there's a lot of things in place to help you with this. So you shouldn't be feeling like I have so much to do and I'm on my own with this, but rather there's a lot of things that people have done for me. And sometimes it's just a case of you taking the step and using the things that are provided to you. So we'll cover things, relatively quickly tonight. But as Adam said, if you do have a question, just jump in with it. I'm more than happy to field any questions that come up over the course of tonight's presentation. So I just want to acknowledge the land that we're all on tonight, elders past and present, and also a special welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us tonight. Thank you for being here. And I also just want to flag the content for tonight. Now, I'm not going to tell you horror stories. I'm not going to try and traumatize you with the worst things that came across my desk when I was working at the Office of the Children's Guardian. But we are going to touch on subjects that can be quite uncomfortable. For a variety of reasons, they can be uncomfortable for us. And it's one of those things that we don't talk about very often. And in some ways, that's part of the problem, is because we don't talk about it much. These things kind of stay hidden. And the more we can bring it out into the open and address it, the less it's going to happen in the future. So tonight's all really focused on how we can stop these things from happening. It's all about prevention. But I do want to acknowledge that, it can be an uncomfortable subject. So if you need to step away from your computer, feel free to. As Adam said, it's being recorded. So if you can't make it through the session, you can always grab a recording and watch it at a pace that suits you. So I thought what might be a useful start point is just to talk about what is safeguarding. So we hear this term thrown around a lot. You hear it from Sport Integrity Australia with the National Integrity Framework, but it doesn't always get kind of clarified exactly what we're talking about with safeguarding. So the really big focus on safeguarding is about prevention of abuse and harm to children. So reporting is a part of it, and it's really important we do understand times where we may need to make a report, whether that be to Triathlon or whether that be to the police or some other government agency. So reporting is an important part of this, but really the focus is on what can we do, what things can we put in place at our clubs that will stop these things from happening in the first place, prevent harm and abuse to children. Now, because of my history working at the Office of the Children's Guardian, very often people become hyper fixated on sexual abuse of children. And there's some valid reason for that. I mean, it is a very, very serious crime that occurs, devastating effects for the victim. And it is, in some ways, sort of, the most severe thing we can think of. But the reality is when we think about not just triathlon, but every sport, every sports field on every Saturday throughout Australia, if we think down the list there to those sort of yellow zone behaviors, toxic behaviors, swearing at children, intimidation, behavior management, coaches who use physical punishments on children that actually leads to injuries and things like that. A lot of these lower level sort of, I don't want to downplay their severity because these things can be very serious, but they're obviously less serious than what we're talking about in the red zone. But this stuff is happening week to week. And so while it's good to think about, how we can prevent the really, really serious forms of abuse, it's also worth thinking about our club. How do we create a culture where the little things aren't happening either? It's also worth saying as well that often these little things, online communication with children is, from my experience working at the OCG, was very commonly a precursor to those more serious cases of abuse. And so the more we can stamp out these lower level breaches, the harder it gets for people to do the really serious stuff as well. So that's not to say we want to ignore the really serious forms of abuse, but just that by addressing some of the more minor forms of abuse and harm that are occurring more regularly in sport, we can actually make it much harder for people to do much more serious breaches of our policies. So we're really focusing on how do we prevent these things from happening. Another, I guess, idea I want to put across to you tonight, and it's somewhat counterintuitive, is that the more elite an athlete gets, the more they hit along the pathways journey, the higher the risk for that young person in terms of abuse and harm. So when we think of really, really talented, gifted young athletes, the sort of ones who are going to be an Olympian one day, we sort of think these are the most empowered young people on the planet. They're superstars in the making. Everyone looks up to them. Everyone admires what they can do on the sports field. But the reality is that they have so much more to lose than your average community athlete who really just wants to participate. And so it's worth thinking about that just in terms of the context of your club, and that, say, an elite pathways group, or if you're working with some kids who are particularly, traveling and going to different meets and things like that, those kids actually are perhaps the ones we need to think about a little bit more, because if you're just competing at the low level, your parents are around a lot more. There isn't as much travel involved. It's not as many hours away from your family either. But when we get to those elite pathways athletes, they're often spending large amounts of time with their coaches and trainers, away from their parents. They might be traveling without their families, and they're put in a lot more positions where they're very vulnerable and exposed to the adults who work with them. In addition, as I said before, it's much harder for these young people to actually speak up, because we're essentially asking them, hey, can you, if your coach is abusing you, we're asking you to tell on the person who may well hold the keys to your career. Like, this is the person who might determine if you get selected for a certain squad or put forward for a certain team. So it's very, very hard for these young people to speak up about the people who they have high levels of interaction with, because these people have so much influence over their potential career. So that's not to say that, junior athletes who aren't in the competitive space, we don't need to worry about them. Obviously, we do as well. But just if you're thinking about maybe some of your, more gifted athletes, the ones who are competing at higher levels, maybe just think about how we're conducting ourselves around them as well. Adam, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no. So just to Matt's point, like, we're acutely aware that our pathway program is our biggest risk. It's also where we invest the most time in child safety. So through our pathway program and the development squads, the overnight camps is without a doubt, not to downplay the risk at other events, but the overnight camps is definitely our biggest risk.
Yeah, great point. Helen, did you want to unmute yourself? I'm not sure if Helen wants to talk. Okay, I'll keep going. Feel free to jump in, Helen, if you do want to ask a question. But I just really wanted to flag this idea because at some of your clubs, you might have some athletes who, they're just in it relatively casually. They love it. They want to keep doing it. But there are others who are taking it a lot more seriously. And we just want to think about maybe how we manage those athletes and making sure that at the club level, we're taking good care of our elite athletes. So I want to throw a couple of scenarios to you. So scenario one, so we've got a guy called Trent. He's a strength and conditioning coach, and he identifies a young athlete as high potential. This kid could go to the Olympics. And so he decides, I'm going to give this child some extra training. Now, in order to remove distractions and tailor the workouts to this child's needs, he works one-on-one with them. And he doesn't want to create an extra burden on the club committee. So he basically operates outside of regular club hours and, works outside of the normal club structures. I'm not sure if everyone can hear that. Someone, I think, might need to mute themselves. Thank you. Okay. So from this guy, hopefully we might be feeling some slight red flags here, that this guy's essentially creating the opportunity to be alone with this child. But essentially, we don't have any indication of bad motivation. Like, this guy it doesn't seem like he wants to do anything bad with this child. He just really wants to push them to be great, right? If we look at scenario two, we're looking at the exact same behaviors, but with different motivation. So here he tells the parents, your child could be a star, but this kid may not even be talented. He's just telling the parents that so he can get alone with his child. And he's deliberately choosing times where he won't have supervision, where he'll be alone with his child and no one can monitor what he's doing. And because these sessions aren't official, they're not through the club, he's using social media to contact this child. He's actually not communicating with them in transparent ways that the club can see how they're communicating or when they're arranging things. It's all very clandestine. And so the reality is, in scenario two, Trent's not only grooming the child, because this is a common misconception, is that when people are grooming a child, they're only grooming the child. Typically, they're also grooming all the other people around them. So they're grooming their colleagues, and they're also manipulating the parents in the club. So the reality here is that this is the same behavior with different motivations. And from the outside looking in, we can't tell the difference. So when you observe someone doing this, arranging these extra sessions, working one-on-one with the child, from you as a sort of outside observer, you can't tell if this person is just hyper dedicated to their craft and really wants this kid to do well, or if it's someone who's engineering situations to be alone with this child for reasons that we would not want this person to have. And so this is why it's really important that we basically don't worry about what the motivation is. We follow our rules, we follow our policies. So the policies that are provided, we want to follow those, follow the strict rules that are in place for triathlon as a sport, and not be breaching them, even if your motivations are noble. The reality is you want to stick to the rules. You don't want to go outside of what normal conduct is. So one way I like to think of the policies that we have is I like to think of them essentially like a couple of fences or barriers. And the idea being that essentially if we all stay within the policies, if we sorry, I've got a bit of an echo going on there. Don't know if we can mute. So if we stay within our policies, if we stay within those barriers and we stay in essentially the green zone, the safe zone, we'll be doing everything we do in a safe way with the kids. And look, there's a lot of different things we might be doing with young people in sport. So from, sports psychology to training to competing to first aid treatment, communication with families, looking at changing areas and things like that, transportation of kids. So there's a lot of different things we might be doing with children in our regular functions as clubs. And we want to make sure when we're doing those things, we keep it within that green zone of following what our policies guide us to do. And we're not ever kind of stepping outside of that policy. So to use me as an example, so I'm actually a qualified tennis coach. And let's say I'm coaching say a 16-year-old and I decide that I'm going to text message this child to tell them that, hey, let's change our tennis practice from 4 o'clock to 3:30. Now, I'm a normal guy. I might text that 16-year-old once, tell them the change of time, and never text them again. And not, as so often becomes the case, unfortunately, where adults will start off with innocuous text messages, but then they start to creep into inappropriate territory. That's why there tends to be blanket rules of do not communicate one-on-one online with kids, because too often it descends into things that it shouldn't. So we blanket say no one text message kids. So if I were to do that, that's a breach of the Tennis Australia rules. And I should be, reprimanded as a tennis coach because I've broken their safeguarding policy. Now, you might say, well, look, it sent one text message, no child was harmed. What's the harm of this? But the reality is, when people start encroaching into what I'd call the yellow zone, outside of policies, you're maybe not harming a child, but you are breaking the rules. What you essentially do is run cover for the people who do want to get to the red zone. So the reality is, look, the majority of us have no interest in harming children. It's not what we want to do. And theoretically, we might be able to go into that yellow zone and then go back to the green zone and it would be as if nothing happened. But if everyone starts going into that yellow zone, it becomes much easier for someone to get to that red zone. And there's a real world example. I won't tell you what sport it was, but where there was a head coach who seemed to be thinking back to those scenarios I just gave. He was sort of scenario one. He was a guy who was quite highly regarded and sort of worked with elite athletes. And he really wanted to push them to, turn pro and all that sort of thing. And so he broke all the rules under the sun. He was taking kids out for dinner. He was communicating with them online. He was, traveling with them and staying in hotels with them, doing all sorts of things that would just make Adam freak out if his triathlon coaches were doing these sorts of things, right? I've seen no evidence that he ever harmed a child. And in fact, all the parents really, really liked this coach because he was so effective, because he got results. But his assistant coach was breaking all those same rules and he was wanting to harm children. So he was grooming all the players while the head coach was breaking the rules too. And the reality is that head coach is someone in the yellow zone. He's breaking the rules. It doesn't seem that he wants to harm children, but he created the environment that allowed that assistant coach to harm children. So he is actually at fault. He is actually part of the problem. So even if your motivations are, as I said, pure and wholesome, and that's not the case, you should never break the rules. It's never okay to break them. But even if you have no intention of, doing anything untoward with children, if you're breaking the rules, you're part of the problem. So it's really important that everyone thinks about this of keeping ourselves within that green zone of safe behavior and not wandering off into the yellow zone, because if we're in the yellow zone, it's much easier for people to get to the red zone. So that's where our policies come in. Our policies are very, very helpful in this area because it helps give us guidance of what the green zone is. Gives us really clear those barriers, those fences are put up for us to guide us on how to behave around children. So what are these policies? is probably worth asking. So what are these fences that we're putting up around people to help them stay in that green safe zone? Well, triathlon is part of the National Integrity Framework, which basically means that Triathlon Australia has agreed to basically sign up to Sport Integrity Australia's program. They've been provided with policies that everyone throughout the country has to use in triathlon. And also, it's worth remembering that those integrity policies are actually approved at the federal level. So the federal government has actually been involved in the development of and has approved those policies. So you know that they're of a very, very high standard. And so that safeguarding policy will actually take care of the vast, vast majority of your policy needs, both from the federal perspective with Triathlon Australia, but then also the New South Wales government perspective. So most of what you need to do at the end of tonight is really just take those national policies and embed them at your club. Start using them, start sharing them with your volunteers, and make sure that you're doing things in a way that actually adheres to those rules. So common areas that people might slip up on is online communication with their athletes, rides in cars. There's certain areas that, excuse me, there's certain areas that we wanna stick to what the policy says, and sometimes clubs may be actually, just as standard breaching some of these rules. So it's worth just familiarizing yourself with them and making sure your club are doing things in accordance with what Australian Triathlon wants you to be doing. But as I said, that will take care of the majority of your policy needs. So you actually don't have to go away and write a whole heap of policies. You really just have to take that one and use it, and that'll get you most of the way to where you need to be. If we take one step down from the Australian federal perspective down to Triathlon New South Wales. So Triathlon New South Wales have been working very hard to produce some really, really helpful resources to support you in this area, and also to help you to get across the line with some of the state requirements that are in place. So the first one is the Working with Children Handbook that's been developed by Triathlon New South Wales, which I actually worked with Triathlon New South Wales on the development of it while I was at the Office of the Children's Guardian. And one of the things that's really good in it is it actually has 10 steps that you can take to help you meet the requirements of the 10 child safe standards. So these are 10 things you could do at your club that would help you to follow New South Wales requirements. It also has guidance on the Working with Children check, who needs a check, and how to use the Working with Children check system, which is something you're expected to do if you're a club that is working with children. And it's really important that we're following that because that is a legal requirement in New South Wales. Another area it has that's really helpful is child safe risk management. So this is a separate document on that page, which is actually around, it's essentially a sample of how do we look at child safe risk management. The reason this is really important is that when we look at the 10 child safe standards, remember how I said that national policy will take care of just about everything you need? The one area it won't do is risk management. So the reason for that is if we think of a national sporting policy, not just triathlon, we could think of any other sport, the NRL or Tennis Australia or Football Australia, any sports national policy, it has to work in every club throughout the country. So we're talking about different states, we're talking about metropolitan city-based clubs, and also small clubs out in a regional space. So we have this one policy that sort of has to try and fit everyone, and what ends up happening is it doesn't quite fit anyone. So it will fit maybe 95% of what you need, but to get that little extra 5%, that's where risk management comes into the picture. And the crucial thing here is thinking about, okay, what are the risks at our club? What are the specific areas that could be a risk at our club? And they might not even be a risk at the club up the road. So based on the facilities you work in or anything like that, you could have very, very different risk profiles. But the idea is to really tailor things and find what are the key areas that we could actually plug some gaps in what the national policy says. So we want to be following the national policy, but then that little bit of risk management on the side is what plugs the gaps and makes sure that we have a really comprehensive safeguarding approach for the kids at our club. The other thing that is flagged. Oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I've managed to work out how to unmute my computer.
Awesome.
before we go too far in this, I guess one of my questions is around the working with children check and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, it's clearly failed in childcare. So I'm just wondering how this is going to work in terms of sports. I mean, I can plug into my system, that, you know, for argument's sake, Matt Sibley is quite okay, but in reality, he's committed crimes elsewhere. The onus seems to be on me as a committee member / as a member of a club to somehow work out that you are in fact not a very ideal person to have in the club, and that puts all the pressure on me and the club. And try New South Wales of I mean, I'm being facetious here, but they kind of say, oh, well, that's okay. They've had a working with children check, so that's fine. So in terms of insurance and all the rest of it, their obligations have been they've met their all obligations. But meanwhile, here I am as a coach or a committee member or as a club member who's potentially got someone who is grooming children and who is, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So I just want to know how that all works.
No, it's a great question, Helen. And I think you've really struck on one really important area here around the working with children check, which is that it isn't the silver bullet that many people think it is. And for the reasons that you've just highlighted, that someone's, previous misdemeanors may not have actually been officially reported. They might not be in a system that the government has access to actually create a bar for this person and take them out of the system and bar them on the working with children check. There's also a lot of really toxic behaviours people might have that don't hit the threshold of losing your working with children check, but are a person you would not want at your club working with kids. Maybe it's just the way they conduct themselves, swear like a sailor. It could be all sorts of reasons why this person is not a person that we want working with our young people. We feel like there's a child safeguarding risk with them. Now, your national policy has some guidance on this around recruitment. So it actually has some advice on questions you can ask people before you let them into your club, before you allow them to work with young people. So if they're going into a child-related role, they're going to have access to your kids. There's some questions. And the nice thing about this is you don't have to be an HR expert. So you don't have to know what questions you should ask and all those sorts of things. It actually provides you samples that you can ask people. I think...
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've said here that there's question on the website. There's questions we can ask members who might potentially come to the club. So I'm just, Helen. I'm just Joe Nobody. And somebody wants to join my club. In fact, they all do it online anyway, so I've got no idea who they are. So how am I in the position to ask them whether they've got a criminal history or whether they've got any issues? I mean, I guess my question is perhaps more to Adam, is what are Try Australia doing to perhaps weed these people out before they get onto the website to be able to join our clubs? Because at the end of the day, the onus shouldn't be on me as a club member or as a committee member or as a volunteer to try and weed out criminals or potential bullies, whatever you want to call them.
Okay, so this conversation is very specific to people who are coming into your club working with children. And what we're talking you through here is steps that, and particularly on the Working with Children handbook, there are steps there, and there's 10 steps that you can go through, and checking Working with Children checks is only one of them. All the rest refer to creating a culture in which you're asking the right questions, you're promoting your child safe standards. Now, for your club, I'm not sure how many junior members you've got, but I wouldn't imagine it being a lot. So there's also rules on when you need to be checking a Working with Children check. And in the Working with Children handbook that we've written, it goes through when you do and do not need it. And it's not a question of gut feel. It's actually legislation. So it's very clearly directed when you do and don't need it. But it is only one tool in your arsenal to protect children in your club. What you're asking is about our criminal policy, which is a separate to the safeguarding children. And my answer to that, and I can give you a call tomorrow and chat about that, but the answer is it is not your responsibility to be background checking members who join online. The criminal policy is if you're made aware of something, flagging it with AusTry. So if someone brings to your attention, this convicted criminal has just joined your club, then I guess there's a policy where you have to flag that with AusTry, and then it's over to them to explore that and make a decision. In fact, I think the CEO of AusTry has to get involved. But they are two very different discussions around.
I guess. Sorry, Adam. I guess even with the working with children's check, I still think the onus still seems to be very much on the clubs to identify potential miscreants, offenders, whatever you want to call them, depending on the level of whatever it is, crime, not crime, it's not a crime, but abuse. And, I think I just wonder if the working with children check seems to be the only solution to this problem. So, so I can go onto the Office Children Check. I've checked that, X, Y, and Z at the moment he's cleared. That's all fine. But that's only in New South Wales, or it only happens to be at a point in time. It's up to me as an individual to potentially identify difficult behaviours, red flags, to then report it to yourself, to then move on. I feel like there's a lot of onus on individual members.
Yeah, so the problem is, Helen, we, as in New South Wales Triathlon, we check the working with children checks of anyone we employ in our pathway program, anyone who we pay money or is working with children that we engage. But we also know in the sport of triathlon, a coach in Hathead could engage a parent could engage a coach, and that coach is employed by that family to coach their child. So the law is very clear on this, that it is up to that parent to check the working with children check of the person that they've employed, just as we check the working with children checks of people we employ. And I have to say, we used to check everyone's working with children checks, and we got told by the Office of Children's Guardian that is not allowed. You can't be doing that because you don't employ them. It is up to the club. So yes, I do hear what you're saying. There is the onus back on the club. We have tried to make it as simple as possible, hence our handbook, which takes a 120-page document around the 10 child safe standards, and we've shrunk it down to 1 page. So we have tried to make it as easy as possible. But I hear what you're saying. There is an onus back on the club to check the working with children checks of those that you employ in a voluntary or paid capacity. And there's kind of no way around that issue.
Yes, I guess I don't have a problem with that at all. I mean, that's quite as it should be, So, yep, okay.
Yeah, and I think the important thing you've hit on is that we don't want to just rely on the check. So when you put someone as the working with children check and you check them, if they come up barred, essentially what it is the New South Wales government has said that person cannot work with children in any capacity, paid or unpaid, anywhere in the state, in any industry. And there's a bit of a threshold for people to hit in order to become barred. It's not something that's sort of taken lightly. But it's essentially the New South Wales government taking the decision out of your hands. They're saying this person, there's under no circumstances should they be working with children. It's that you don't have to make a decision. The Office of Children's Guardian, the New South Wales government has made it for you. Now, because that threshold is quite high, there will be other people who they may even have a cleared working with children check. They give you their check, it comes up cleared, but there are reasons that you think that this person isn't safe to be at your club. Now, So you can say no to someone with a clear check. I think that's a really important thing to emphasize. Like, you do have that ability through your recruitment process to say, look, we have some concerns, so we're not going to engage this person. The other thing, and this is what Adam was getting to with the 10 steps you can take to meet the requirements of the 10 child safe standards, is that in that handbook, it gives you guidance on things you can do at your club that will mean that if you were to take someone who, let's say they're in a grey area, they're not barred from the working with children sheet. We definitely don't want that person at our club, but it's someone who they may be a bit of rough around the edges, or there may be some areas where this person might not be perfectly aligned with working with children. And it's worth saying that could just be inexperience. They haven't worked with children before, so they just don't have the expertise or the knowledge of how to work with kids. And I see this, for instance, in the NRL, where you'll have former players who want to give back to the game, they want to coach at junior level, but their reference of talking to players at halftime is the way Craig Bellamy yelled at them at halftime. And so they go to the 10-year-olds and start yelling at them like an NRL coach, right? That's not someone who necessarily is a problem. They just lack a bit of training or a bit of understanding of how to work with kids. And so a lot of it is also about, as Adam was saying, building that culture and creating that environment where people will start to align with your club's values, and they'll start to actually conduct themselves in the way that you ideally would want. So it's not a case of clear check, we let everyone into our club who has a clear check and we just kind of let them do whatever they want. Instead, we've got quite a controlled environment where when people come in, if they're barred, we definitely don't let them in. If they do come into our club, we have a set of expectations that we're making really clear to them as soon as they join. We're giving them really clear guidance on when you're working with kids. These are some of the rules that you need to follow. So by creating that environment, that'll take a bit of pressure off you sort of getting it right or not. And then the other thing is, if they're breaking those rules that you're setting for them, then that becomes a reason to maybe remove them from your program. So if you start having someone who is text messaging kids or is yelling at them and swearing at them or doing other things that are at odds with the safeguarding policies that you're expected to follow, then that's a measure to then say, okay, look, while this person isn't barred from working with children by the government, we don't want them working with our children, so we're going to remove them from our club. We're going to take them out of child-related work. So you're exactly right that it isn't just the check that's going to solve this, and in fact that the check is not really the solution. It's part of the package, but there's a lot more that we should be doing as clubs to create an environment where kids are safe.
And before we move on, I will say that for the child safe risk management, as in your risk assessment, we have a number of templates that I will share out with you all tomorrow. Warringah Tri Club have shared theirs with me, and so have Central Coast Tri Club. Plus, we have a number that sit in our pathway program. For every program, camp or clinic we run, we also do a risk assessment. So when I send you all an email following this up tomorrow, I'll provide some template risk management. They're not up on our website, but they're a good start when and if you guys are sitting down and doing your child safe risk assessments.
Yeah. No, and they are. They're very helpful. They'll give you really good guidance. We're going to touch on that at the end of tonight as well.
Sure.
The other thing that's really helpful here is the child safe sport e-learning that the Office of the Children's Guardian developed. And module 1 of that only takes about 20 minutes to complete. So it's a very quick, easy thing to complete. And so that's something that, for instance, if you're taking on a new person, they've cleared their working with children check, but a clearance on a working with children sheet doesn't necessarily mean a person's safe. So we're going to give them this e-learning to complete, which will set some ground rules, some expectations, help them understand the importance of being safe around children. It's worth also saying that while we're talking a lot about keeping children safe, a big part of this as well is about helping adults to keep themselves safe. So how do adults conduct themselves in a way where they aren't putting themselves in risky situations? So it's partly about let's protect our kids, but it's also about how do we set up our volunteers to conduct themselves in a way where they don't put themselves in risky situations around children, do things that actually, a bit like those scenarios that we had earlier, could be misinterpreted, or, this is something, if you're doing this, someone will report you because this looks dodgy. Even if you've got no bad intentions, this is something you shouldn't be doing. So we're trying to set people up for success by giving them a lot of guidance and a lot of, access to policies and all those sorts of things.
So can I just come back to that point about reporting you? So I think someone is bullying and isn't a very good person in the club. So I then report it to Try New South Wales. Presumably they then conduct an investigation, and that's all good and well. But me as the individual, the potential is for that child's parent or whatever to suggest that perhaps I've been discriminatory, or I've defamed them, etc., etc. I mean, I might be going over the top here, but I'm just kind of, I just feel that there's a lot of pressure on us as individuals, and we're just volunteers. We're not paid people. We're not, even as a coach, you're just a volunteer, and you're expected to do so much. And I guess what support is there for us in that instance where, here we are, we're now in a situation where Jane's parents have said, well, no, you've suggested that whatever, Coach X has suggested that I've been discriminatory and suggested, do you know what I mean? So I presume Try Australia would go into investigations and do all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, look, I think it's probably a good idea. Maybe I'll give you a call tomorrow, but there is a national integrity framework. And please don't think I'm in any way not going to have a good chat to you tomorrow and go through the national integrity framework and the steps taken. But I'm also conscious we've only got 15 minutes left.
Okay, sorry. Yep, sorry.
I'm also, Helen, I'll give you a buzz tomorrow, and we can talk through the reporting process. There is a national integrity manager who complaints can come to me, and then we bring a national integrity manager in whose role is to help us work through issues and complaints as they come up, and they would guide us, and they've got access into Sports Integrity Australia. So there are some resources. But maybe it's worth me giving you a buzz tomorrow, because it sounds like there's a lot more to this question that requires some, if that's okay, Helen, please.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, thank you.
So around the working with children check really quickly. So in terms of what you're going to do as a club, the first thing you need to figure out is, do we need to actually have anyone have a working with children check? So obviously if a club doesn't have any children, it's likely they don't need a working with children check. So that's why we don't say blanket every triathlon club needs to have the working with children check system and everything, because there are clubs out there with no juniors. The other thing is there can be exemptions. Things like parents are often exempt from needing a working with children check if they're coaching their own child. So if it's a very small club where it's all parents coaching their own children, then they may not need to engage with the working with children check system. But for the majority of you, it probably is a case where you're going to look at it and go, yes, we do need one. Someone in our club is going to need a working with children check. The first step to do is to register with Office of Children's Guardian as an employer, essentially saying we have adults who work with children and we need to check them. And that links you in the system as, they'll know that your club exists and that you have children at your club. You may have already registered. And so if you've registered in the past, but you're not sure how to access your account, then you can contact the OCG and ask them to sort of regain access for you, and they'll, set up new passwords and all that sort of thing for you. But if you've never done it before, first step is to register. Then you collect all the working with children check numbers of all of your people who work with children. And then this is the really important step, is you verify those people. So having a working with children check number doesn't actually mean anything. It's like a person could be barred, a person could be cleared, and there's a number of other statuses they might have. And just looking at their number, you can't tell what their status is. The only way to find out if they've been barred or if they're still cleared is to go verify them in the system. So you log in as the employer, as the club, and you input people's details, and then with each one it will tell you this person's cleared, this person's barred, this person's cleared. Anyone who's barred, we're not going to use. If they come up cleared, all good. The other thing you do need to do, and this is something that a lot of sports clubs leave off, it's actually explicitly said in the legislation, is you're required to verify everyone. You're also expected to keep records of who you've verified. So there are templates on the Office of Children's Guardian website that have, like spreadsheets where you just input the information of each person you verified, when you verified them, that they came up cleared, etc. And also expiry dates is good to keep track of because a working with children check only lasts 5 years. So at the end of every 5 years, that person needs to go get a renew their working with children check. And as a club, you're going to need to input their new check when they get a renewal. So you keep those records. Now, the reason the records are really useful is that if you keep records of who you've checked, it's not a moment in time. So when I go get a police background check and they say Matt Sibley has committed no crimes, the day I get that check, if I commit a crime tomorrow, that piece of paper is still going to say Matt Sibley's never committed any crimes. So a police check is a moment in time check. The working with children check in New South Wales is actually continuously monitored. So if, let's say I join your club as a coach and you verify me in the system, and let's say 6 months later, I become barred, I do some things and I lose my working with children check, the Office of Children's Guardian will contact your club if you've verified that person. So when someone becomes barred, there's a team at the Office of Children's Guardian who will literally call their church, the school they work at, the sports club they volunteer at, and they might have to call 4 different places where this person works with kids and tell each of those employers you can't use this person. So if someone becomes barred, you will be notified, you will be contacted, but only if you've done that verification. So if you don't verify, the Office of Children's Guardian doesn't know to tell you that this person's become barred. But what that does mean, if you keep those records, you don't have to necessarily be verifying every single person in your club every single season. Because if people are working continuously with your club, then they're still in the system until their check expires. Once they've had their check for 5 years, they'll need to renew. Then you need to put them back into the system. But the Office of Children's Guardian will monitor that person, and if they become barred, you will get told, but only if you verify. So that verification step, super important. So you set up your account with the OCG and then you start verifying people. And now they know to contact you because when you register, you also give contact details so that they can get a hold of you if one of your people were to become barred. So it's actually a really, really good system. But as we addressed earlier, it's not foolproof. It's not perfect. There's lots of people you do not want at your club who are cleared. They have a clearance to work with kids, but we don't want them working with kids because they have bad attitudes or bad behaviors. So just because someone's cleared, you don't have to use that person. You can turn them away. You can decide you don't want to use them as a coach because you have concerns about them in terms of safety. And again, that handbook has guidance on how to follow those steps for working with children check, and also who needs one and who doesn't, and all those different things. So in terms of recruitment, so we've got the working with children check, one part of recruitment, a very, very useful part, but not the whole picture. The national policy, as I said, has sample questions. So it has guidance on what are the sort of things I can ask someone who wants to coach kids that might help me see, oh, actually, maybe we shouldn't have this person there. Some of the answers they're giving are raising red flags. So it has some guidance on how to do that. Reference checks can also be really useful. So if someone wants to coach kids, say, hey, look, have you got an employer or your previous club? Could you give us, the club you worked at last year? So we can just give them a call and hear from them. And I will say, in my opinion, the most useful thing you can ask someone is, can you tell me what clubs, not just triathlon, but any other sports that you've volunteered at in the past? And so they might have helped out at a rugby league club and a cricket club. You might then be able to contact those clubs and just say, hey, look, we've got John Smith here. He says he helped out with you guys last season. Was he all right? If they had any problems with the guy, they will let you know. The reason I think this is such a valuable question to ask is I'll give you an example. I won't tell you what sports were involved, but there was a person who was banned for life from one sport who switched to a different sport in order to continue coaching. So this person changed into a different sport. That sport had no idea that this person had been banned for life from the original sport and took them on as a coach. This person was toxic, abusive. The club basically was fracturing down the middle and ended up basically dissolving because this person had infiltrated and become so toxic. Now, if they'd simply asked the question, could you tell us any other clubs you've volunteered at recently? That person, a couple of things would have either happened. One, they would have had to admit, yeah, I was actually coaching at the club across town in a different sport. And then you would find out that person was banned for life. or they would lie, and then later on, when they found out that they found out this person's history later on, but by then the damage had been done. So, but if you find out the person's lying to you, that gives you very good grounds to remove that person, because you can say you lied to us when you actually joined the club. You didn't disclose to us that you've been coaching at a different sport last year. So it's a really useful question to ask people, is just, hey, could you just let us know what clubs you've helped out with in the past, and maybe not even including triathlon, but other sports as well, other sports you've helped out at and what clubs. Very, very useful question to ask, because you can start to maybe piece things together. And I have had dealings with some sports where there's a person who's essentially bounced around club to club. Every 6 months they change to a different club. As the heat starts to come on to them, and they start, people start asking questions about why they behave certain ways, they'll jump to a different club before the formal investigation happens. And so I've had some sports where they've essentially had to almost put out a notice to everyone, do not engage this person, because they've got this track record and they've been at 8 clubs in 4 years, sort of thing. So it can be very useful to try and get a bit of that volunteer history off them. And that's a very easy question to ask, and it's a very easy question for them to answer. It's simply an email with, here's the 4 clubs I've worked at in the past, and they just list the clubs. They don't have to give you any more information than that, but very helpful question to ask. The other thing worth saying, though, is we can really fixate on whether or not we let people into our club. And certainly just remember, just even with a clearance, you can still say no to people and not let them coach at your club. But once you let people in, whether you have a bad feeling about them or not, that induction and supervision is so important. So you bring someone in, you want to give the coach a bit of coaching and how to be a good coach. What are the rules we need to follow? What are the values of our club? How do we expect you to behave when you're around the kids at our club? So setting them up for success, but also being able to hold them to account if they break the rules. If no one's ever told them what the rules are, they can turn around and go, oh, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to text the kids. But if we go through the rules, if we explain the expectations and they do break them, it's much easier for you as a club to address it and say, look, we told you not to text message the kids. We told you to use the club emails, or, whatever procedure the club uses. We told you only to communicate with the parents, not with the children. You've broken that rule. We're going to have to deal with this. So by essentially setting the expectations early, it's actually easier to then deal with someone who does want to break the rules, particularly if they're going to break them repeatedly. Becomes very easy to remove that person, compared to if we set no expectations, we don't have any rules, becomes very hard to then police people and deal with them if they are a problem person. I think probably the crucial thing here is, ideally what you want to have, and this is what the national policy is there to help you have, is a process that makes it easier for you to say no to someone who you have concerns about. So again, barred working with children check, very easy to say no to that person. Do you have to? It's the law. But if someone has a clearance, but you still have concerns, having a process you follow for each of your coaches, whenever a new person comes, you have a process to determine whether or not you want them to coach. If you have that process, then that process becomes the means by which you can say no. And that's why I often say to people, if I'm running a club and my own brother applies to be a coach, I'm going to have that club do a recruitment process with my own brother, who I know and trust, because if I do it with him and I do it with everyone else, then it becomes a consistent process and becomes much easier to say no to the wrong person. If it's all very ad hoc and we don't really follow a process, that's when you can feel uncomfortable about saying no to someone, because as Helen sort of alluded to, am I discriminating? Is it that I have a problem with this person because they have a Kiwi accent, for instance? If you've got the process and you follow that process, it becomes much easier to say no to people. Social media is the most common thing that came up in my time at the OCG. So when I had a sport come to me and there was an incident and they were, the police and everything was involved, there was almost always some sort of social media component to it. So the national policy is really clear with us that you're not to communicate one-on-one with children. So you usually include another adult, whether that's their parents, whether it's another adult at the club. But in some way, what we're not doing is communicating one-on-one with kids, because that's essentially walking into a room and closing the door behind me and no one can see in and see what's happening. So it's really important that we set that clear expectation with our coaches, that we make it really clear to them, but that I know it might be convenient, but you're not messaging the kids on their social media. All right, you need to contact the parents, or you need to do something else. And again, part of this is about those adults not putting themselves at risk, because if they're messaging kids one-on-one, that's very easy to become a situation that puts them in danger as well. So set those really clear expectations. And the other thing is you can set these expectations with the kids as well. So say to the kids, look, I'm your coach. I'm glad we're having a lot of fun, but you can't add me on social media. It's against the rules. You can add the club's social media, but not my personal one. So please don't friend request me or follow, or, whatever the social media jargon is these days. So you can also set that expectation, particularly with the older kids who might be pretty active on social media, just to say like, look, please don't friend request me, because it's actually showing a lot of disrespect, because you're essentially asking me to break the rules, which could get me in trouble. So just don't ask, please. So really, really common area. It's definitely one you want to be mindful of. And a lot of clubs are not really policing this very well, and they're not doing a great job of, and in fact, some clubs might even be making their coaches message the kids on WhatsApp in order to arrange things. So trying to find ways to use official platforms within the club and include parents in these messages, things like that will make a big difference and make it a lot safer for everyone. In terms of risk, really quickly, I think the thing to be mindful of is that in your sport, as opposed to other sports, there'll be different risks that you encounter, but also club to club, your risks are very unique. So we can think about changing areas as a really common one. We can think about the distances involved in triathlon. So sometimes kids are actually on their bike going quite far away. So sight lines can be a challenge, and also we can think about public space versus private. So you might have access to a swimming pool at a time when there are no public users and you have essentially a private facility, or you might be sharing a swimming pool with the general public. And obviously that presents some different challenges in terms of safety, in terms of changing areas, all those sorts of things. We think about transportation with kids. Obviously overnight stays is high risk, as Adam alluded to. But again, social media, really, really common risk area. So depending on your club, some of these might be very high risk, some of them might be lower risk, based on things like, the facilities you use, the size of your club, the number of volunteers you have available. Is it a single coach by themselves with the kids? Would you have several adults on hand? And, there's never really opportunity to be alone with kids. And it's worth saying, in the child safeguarding space, the number one risk to children and adults is being alone with the child. If an adult is alone with the child, that's a very vulnerable position for that child. It's also quite an exposed situation for the adult. So that's what we're trying to avoid, is these situations where you end up with an adult alone with the kids. And there isn't really a second set of eyes or anyone supervising, both to monitor the behavior of the adult, but also to witness things and be in some ways a protective factor for the adult too. So as an adult, you should probably be reluctant to be alone with children for extended periods. So if you look at the risk management document that Adam is going to share with you, basically you have your risk matrix. The idea being, we're really looking at two factors here. One is, how likely is it that the situation will occur? If it almost never happens, it's obviously not a high risk thing most of the time. If it happens every week, then that increases the risk, because it's obviously happening repeatedly. And then the other question is, what are the consequences if this were to happen? So is it a very, very low risk thing? It wouldn't be that bad. Like, it's not good. We don't want it to happen. But if it did happen, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Or is this something that is going to be catastrophic for this young person? And it's a really bad situation. And that helps you determine what the risk is in a certain moment. So to give you some examples, so let's say one of the risk factors we might be thinking about is adults communicating with children online on their phone. If your club doesn't have clear rules about this, I would say the likelihood is almost certain. And I say that from experience, having witnessed how many clubs are doing it and are still doing it. It's a very, very commonplace thing. The risk here in terms of grooming, in terms of, online abuse, bullying, all these sorts of things is incredibly high. So the consequences could be severe if you have adults communicating one-on-one with children. And I would argue for many clubs, now maybe not your club, you might have rules in place and you might go through those rules with your coaches, and you could say the likelihood is actually quite low. Now, if that's the case, this risk is going to go right down, right? So that's what we want to do, is assess the risk and then put things in place that reduce it. Now, in terms of that risk, if you're the club that is just kind of letting this happen, I would say that risk is very extreme. So it's a very high risk behavior to have adults and children one-on-one online. Now, in terms of our national policy, that's one thing that's always a good thing to look at first. It does prohibit one-on-one online communications. There is actually a rule in our national policy to help us here. But what control measures can we put in place as a club at the club level? Well, we can promote our national policy and make it really clear that that is one of the rules. We can also tell the children the rules, because if I start text messaging your child, your son or daughter, the only way you find out is if they know to tell you, hey, my coach has started texting me at night. I know that's against the rules. Can you please get it to stop? So telling the children what some of the rules are can be really useful here. And then creating, a way to communicate with families through official channels at your club can be a really good measure. Whether that's an email that people use to communicate with families, that sort of thing can be really helpful. So the idea is we assess what the risk is, and then we figure out what we could do to reduce that risk. Put in those control measures. And if you were to do that for a year and you were to reassess this risk, that likelihood would go from almost certain to much lower. And so that would reduce the risk along with it. As another example, an adult alone with a child in equipment areas. Now, the likelihood of this is actually, if a club doesn't have rules, pretty likely this is going to happen. And the consequences, I would put it, say moderate, because it's, depending, and this depends a bit on the equipment area. Is this equipment area behind the back of the building and no one knows who's going in and out? Or is it right next to the pool deck and actually everyone can kind of see who's going in and out, and it's actually somewhat monitored? So depending on the individual facility that you operate in, this could range anywhere from relatively low risk to incredibly high risk. It would just depend on maybe the physical makeup of things. But the idea would be is that here, if the likelihood is likely and the consequence would be moderate, we'd put it at a high risk situation. In terms of our national policy, this is actually an interesting one, is that national policies, not just triathlon, but every sport in Australia, do not have rules around equipment areas. So there's no specific rules around who should or shouldn't be going into equipment areas. The closest thing you can get to something relevant is avoid one-on-one unsupervised contact with children. So there is maybe a rule there, but nothing explicit about equipment spaces. So as a club, and this is where risk management becomes really useful, because if you have a high risk equipment area, you as a club can, based on your risk management plan, go, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to say only adults in the equipment areas. We're going to put signs up. And we're going to tell the children you're not to go into those areas. Now, by doing that, immediately you don't have adults and children alone in equipment areas, and that risk goes from high or even extreme all the way down to low. So the idea is we identify the risk and then we put something in place that will reduce that risk. I've got one last one here really quickly, which is adults alone with a child in their car. Depending on the club, so some clubs basically parents pick every kid up. The coaches never travel with the kids. I've worked with soccer clubs where, for instance, they hire buses to transport kids, so the coaches never have to be with the kids. Depending on the club, some would have this be something that never happens. Some would have it be something that's happening very regularly. So again, the risk is going to vary from club to club. But let's say this club is pretty good on this and they don't tend to allow coaches to travel with children. The consequences may be moderate because it's not happening often. And if it did happen, people would notice. But still high risk because it's an adult and a child alone. It's actually still a very high risk scenario. So in terms of the national policy, there's some clear rules here around, transparency with the parents and with the club. So if a coach is transporting a child, they need formal approval, written approval from the parents to take their child, and also formal approval from the club to say, yes, we're okay with you taking that child. And then in terms of control measures, some clubs will actually require parents to stay during trainings, or they'll have very, very strict rules around parents need to be here at X time, and there's maybe punishments if parents are late. And part of that is acknowledging that when parents show up late, they're putting coaches at risk because those coaches are now having to wait around and supervise their child after the training session has ended. And, they could actually be putting that coach at risk. So So hopefully that just touches a little bit on this risk process. And again, the key here is it's not about solving every problem in the world, because most of the problems have actually been dealt with for you by the national policy. What we're doing is maybe identifying those areas that are gaps, those areas where there's a reason why our club has a heightened risk. What can we do to reduce that risk? And if we start doing things like this, it creates that environment where coaches understand that they need to follow the rules and they need to, adhere to the national policy and things like that. But also, we may have some club rules, such as no kids in the equipment areas, or things like that. Rules around your car park, rules around different spaces and different parts of where you operate. So that's the idea with risk. And if you can do that little piece of work, and that sits alongside your national policy essentially, and just kind of plugs a few gaps. That's it from me tonight. I don't know if Adam has any additions you'd like to make. I understand we've run over a little bit. Appreciate everyone's patience.
No, just to say thanks, everyone. Happy to take any burn. I'm aware that we're 7 minutes over time. So if there's any burning questions that you really have to throw out there tonight, please do now. But you're very welcome to give me a call tomorrow and we can talk through. Helen, I'll be in touch with you. I'm going to shoot you all an email with all of the policies, but I want you all to feel, I don't want anyone to feel like this is scary or confronting. We have got some good documents which are really deliberately written, easy and not too long, because I'm very aware that child safety is just one of a range of areas that you as volunteers are focused on, including event delivery and running a fantastic club. There's a whole bunch of things that are very important, but child safety is as well. So I would suggest that we're all here to help, is my final concluding remark. As many days in a row, as many times as we need to sit with you and your committee to talk you through it. We have templates, which I'll share with you all tomorrow. But I'm not seeing any hands go up for any burning questions. So I'll just finish by saying feel free to provide some feedback to Matt. But Matt, thank you for jumping on. It's great to have a subject matter expert leading these types of conversations. And thanks for all your support of creating a child-safe environment for New South Wales Triathlon and our clubs.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. And everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Great. Awesome.
Thank you, Matt.
Good night.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Sweet.
Cheers.
Anything on the insurance policy? You have a